In December 1930, a young writer named Jack DeWitt found himself on Devil's Island in French Guiana on a story for a crime magazine that he wrote for. But when he arrived, authorities there directed him to a prisoner who had made quite the confession. DeWitt, who would later go on to become a screenwriter for mostly B-movies and television, would write the script for the 1957 film noir Portland Exposé, a fictional story based on a recent Vice scandal that broke out in Portland, Oregon. And here, more than 25 years earlier, he was about to sit down with a man who had a little to say about Portland, Oregon himself. He was introduced to DeWitt as Edouard Henry Lepine. It was December 19th, 1930, and Lepine was set to be executed by guillotine the following day for multiple murders. He had no reason to hide anything anymore. He began his confession. I had a friend in an American city, and I cut up the body of this man. Altogether, it would be a jarring confession, bringing to light one of the Pacific Northwest's most grisly and forgotten murder stories. Sullivan's Gulch, a long depression running east and west in northeast Portland, is a mixed bag of transportation. A Union Pacific Railroad line, TriMet's red, blue, and green lines, and Interstate 84. But you go back far enough and the gulch was smaller, with only the railroad line going through there. This is how the gulch was back in 1920. In particular, February 8th of that year. In the early afternoon of this day, Louis DeSantos, an employee for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway, was down on these tracks. While down here, at a place just east of the Grand Avenue Viaduct, he stumbled onto something quite strange. 3 individual packages wrapped in local newspapers, bound with string. Curious, like anyone, he approached these packages and took a look inside. What DeSantos saw shook him up so much that he left the area and would not report his findings until hours later. At that point, local police were called to the area to see what had been wrapped up in those newspapers. One package was found to contain the hip portion of a man's body. The other 2 were found to contain a man's right thigh and the calves from both left and right legs. A mad butcher appeared to be on the loose. The flesh was described as mercilessly hacked by a sharp weapon of some kind. A hat and a pair of trousers were found close by, but later determined to not be tied to the remains recovered. Taken to the county coroner, Leo Gertsch, he determined that the victim in question had not been dead any more than 5 days. It had been raining recently, and yet the packages recovered weren't wet or rain damaged. It was thus felt that the packages hadn't been in the gulch that long, which makes sense as they were out in the open along a railroad line that several workers frequented. Of the newspapers found wrapped around the remains, the most recent paper was a February 2nd, 1920 edition of the Morning Oregonian, and thus the victim couldn't have been killed any earlier than that. Local investigators realized right away they had their work cut out for them, as there was nothing else of significance found in the Sullivan's Gulch area. no remote idea who these remains belonged to or who was responsible for putting them there. A few witnesses came forward in relation to things they'd recently seen on the Grand Avenue Viaduct, and the initial theory was that these packages, based on where they were found, had been thrown from the viaduct above. And with how far the railing was from the street and how heavy these packages were, collectively, it was believed whoever did this must have stopped their car, got out, and stepped up to the railing before throwing them. One man came forward and said he saw a man stop his car on the viaduct around 2 a.m. on February 6th, 2 days before the remains were found. The man got out of the car for a time, but was not seen throwing anything over the edge. 2 street cleaners would come forward on February 11th and tell the police that they'd seen the same car with no license plate and lights off on multiple nights stop on the viaduct. This started nights before the remains were found, which led investigators to dismiss its significance, as this seemed unlikely for the responsible party to do. While the idea of the packages being thrown from the viaduct never went away, a new theory that investigators began to follow was that the guilty party loaded these packages onto a freight car and, at this point in the gulch, probably at night, threw them out and remained in hiding as the train continued on its journey. But only a couple days after this Sullivan's Gulch discovery, the likelihood of the guilty party using the railroad line over a car on Grand Avenue would decrease considerably. Beyond the specific body parts found and the method they had been hacked up in, there was one other thing that might have been of significance. This was that traces of sawdust were recovered from the body parts. It was considered at this time that the victim may have been killed elsewhere and shipped to the Portland area in a box that had been filled with sawdust. However, upon closer examination, sand particles were also uncovered amidst this sawdust. This led investigators to shift their perspective a bit, figuring the victim's body had been placed on a basement floor, or something comparable, where these remains picked up these particles. It was also noticed that there was a strong lack of blood accompanying these remains, and thus it was suggested the parts had been placed in sawdust to soak up most of the blood. These were small discoveries, but there wasn't a whole lot else to go on at the time. The first avenue to check was the possibility that this was a joke committed by students from a nearby medical school, a place that just might have cadavers available. But when local medical schools were checked out, it was found none of them were missing any cadavers, or even just parts of cadavers. On February 7th, only hours after these remains were found, adding some brief extra drama to the day, 2 kids named Gary Sundleaf and Hurley Eccles were playing near Oaks Park in Selwood, in the area now known as the Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. While playing, they were shocked to find a man's head in a shallow pond. For a split second, it was wondered if this head belonged with those lower body parts found in Sullivan's Gulch. Investigators were quick to dismiss this, believing the head belonged to a man named Walter York, who'd drowned in the Willamette River just over 2 months earlier. While this conclusion was drawn at the time, no one could explain how this head was severed, with no signs of violence, from a drowned victim's body, much less how this head could have made its way out of the river, across land, and into a small pond close by. It was a truly gruesome Saturday afternoon. Little did locals realize at this moment that things were just getting started. Finding further body parts from this presumably one male victim, would be difficult. Who knew where they might have been, had they been left out somewhere at all? Lieutenant Jack Goltz asked everyone in the city to keep their eyes open. He said, "Search brush, vacant lots, gullies, and any other place where parts of a man's body may be hidden." Local Boy Scouts were even asked to go on searches and look through shrubs and thickets around town. Young boys being sent on a scavenger hunt for mutilated human remains. Now that's doing your part for the community. While you never hope to discover further harm inflicted on someone in relation to an unsolved crime, it seemed a second discovery was imperative to move this investigation forward. By February 10th, 1920, 3 days after the Sullivan's Gulch discovery, while there was a fresh lead by this time that I will discuss in the next section, a couple Kenton residents in North Portland were out on a walk. While passing through a vacant lot near North Brandon Avenue and McClellan Street, next to Kenton Park today, Charles Moxley and Frank Love, like Louis DeSantos, stumbled onto something interesting. Nestled in a thicket, they saw 2 packages that had been wrapped up in local newspapers. Intrigued, they reported this sighting to a nearby friend, W.A. Hall, who ran a blacksmith shop nearby on Willis Boulevard. Knowing body parts had recently been found wrapped in newspaper, they called the police to the scene. The packages were opened, and the worst outcome happened again. More severed body parts. In these packages were the portions of the lower part of a man's torso, from just above the hips to the lower ribs. Like with the Gulch remains, there was little blood left over in these ones, with traces of sawdust and sand on them. They were described as looking similar to meat in a butcher shop. A deep incision in the stomach may alone have caused death, and the fact that these remains came from directly above the hips and the remains found in Sullivan's Gulch consisted of the hips and portions of the legs of a man got people thinking these remains were from the same person. These remains had again also been wrapped in newspaper and tied off with the same kind of string that had tied off the Sullivan's Gulch remains. Coroner Gertsch said these remains had skin of the same texture, age, and color as those found in the Gulch. There was no doubt that these discoveries were related. And like with the earlier remains found, there was a witness to a vehicle stopped in the area where these Kenton remains were found. A Mrs. John Crawford, who lived at the southwest corner of Brandon and McClellan, on land that is now part of Kenton Park, heard a car traveling at a high rate of speed around 10 p.m. on what she believed was the night of February 7th. If she was right, it syncs up with the Gulch remains, in which they were found the following day and likely had been discarded there the night of the 7th, or possibly early morning hours of the 8th. This high-speed vehicle abruptly came to a stop near Crawford's home, where it sat for about 30 minutes. They made enough noise to get Crawford's attention, but when she looked outside, the car was parked in a very dark area and she could not make out whatever might have been going on there. As with the Grand Avenue viaduct mentioned before, with where the Kenton remains were found, deep in a thicket, one could not have just thrown them from a moving car. Whoever did this would have had to stop, get out, and stash these remains in that thicket. This second discovery changed everything. It made hopes stronger that the victim may be identified at some point, especially if more remains turned up. It also shifted the perspective on how the packages were deposited into the Gulch. Had the Kenton remains been discarded on the same night, throwing some from a train suddenly seemed less likely. But one with an automobile available to them could throw the remains from the Grand Avenue Viaduct and then zoom north on Grand Avenue, merging onto Union Avenue. They could have then used any number of streets to go a short distance west and then into the Kenton area and leave these next packages. Obviously, the investigators were, more than anything, hoping to find the victim's head, making an identification obviously easier. The Columbia Slough on the north end of Kenton was searched, as it was seriously considered the guilty party had thrown the head in there after leaving the Kenton packages. Nothing would be found in the slough. The Rose City was shaken up. Someone was out there capable of killing in a way that was fairly foreign to people at this time. This was not normal. This was not common. This was also still a long ways away from being solved. This meant a victim was still out there waiting to be identified, and that the crazed lunatic killer was still out on the streets somewhere. But perhaps the identification of the victim was not too far away. With the first remains found in the early afternoon of February 8th, the latest the victim could have been alive would have been the previous day, and even that may have been a stretch, with the coroner suggesting he had been deceased possibly as long as 5 days. So the question became, had a local man gone missing recently? Well, it just so happened that one man apparently had vanished into thin air. On February 5th, 1920, 52-year-old Ernest Descamps, a Beaverton resident, had been in Portland on business, as he often did twice weekly. Born in 1867 in France, he came to America in 1886 and sometime prior to 1893 had come to Portland, where he would remain for many years. He would work his way up to running a liquor business with a man named Cesar Marco in the city's North End, becoming a prominent figure in that area in the years leading up to Prohibition. Once that struck Oregon in 1916, Descamps moved out of the city, settling in the small town of Clatskanie for a time, and then moving to a secluded farmhouse in Beaverton. Despite his liquor business going under, he had remained fairly affluent, for reasons I'll go into greater detail on in another section. During this particular trip, Descamps arrived in Portland on February 4th, reportedly carrying a lot of cash on his person. He checked in at the Franklin Hotel, the place he often stayed at when he was in town. Located at Southwest 13th and Washington, Descamps was such a frequent visitor to the Franklin that he reportedly had written phone numbers from women he'd had liaisons with on the walls of his room. After checking in, he visited a close friend, Mrs. V. Gardner, at her home located at what would today be 24 Northwest 10th Avenue, or this little parking lot across from Powell's Books. Gardner said Descamps received a phone call while visiting, wherein he was on the phone for several minutes, but she gave no further information as to what this call may have consisted of. His primary purpose in town was to meet with Mrs. B. L. Griffith on business matters. Being a neighbor of his, they were to then return to Beaverton together. Different sources gave their planned meeting time the next day, February 5th, as either noon or 2 p.m. After waking up, as a man who liked to follow the stock market, Descamps paid a visit to the Board of Trade building at 4th and Oak, an intersection where characters tied to murders have frequently popped up. Killed in her home in 1914 by an obsessed man, a stenographer named Emma Ulrich worked in the Lewis building across Oak Street from here, and across 4th is the Henry building where Joseph H. Klecker worked, a man who would end up tied up in the mysterious murder of a man named Harry Agee in 1921. For our sake, Descamps was here briefly, checking on the market, leaving sometime around 10 a.m. He next went to the Yamhill Market at 5th and Yamhill, where he encountered George Flechelle, a man he'd previously done business with. Here's a land deal they did, published in a November 11th, 1908 newspaper. They met here at approximately 10:30 a.m., where they had a brief exchange while Descamps purchased provisions from the market to take back to Beaverton. Little did Flechelle know, when the two men parted ways, that he'd be the last person to see Descamps alive. After leaving the market, it's said that Descamps was planning on returning to his room at the Franklin, where he was going to change into his ranch suit, but he never showed. He also never showed up for his meeting with Mrs. Griffith. She was shocked by his no-show, as he was the type who, if plans had to change, he would make sure to let you know. And this was only the beginning of appointments that the shrewd businessman would never show up for. After his planned return home on February 5th, Descamps had hired some men to come to his farm and do some woodcutting there the next day. The men arrived and Descamps wasn't home, so they just moved on to the next job. Descamps also had a scheduled meeting in Oregon City with a man named Herbert McManus on February 8th, the same day some body parts were found in Sullivan's Gulch. He not only didn't keep this appointment, but he didn't show for a dinner with Mrs. Gardner planned to happen before he went down to Oregon City. Despite all of this, Descamps' concerning disappearance wasn't reported right away, and those in Beaverton who knew him just assumed he'd stayed in Portland a little longer than expected. And when he vanished from Portland, it was assumed he just went back home. But with so many missed appointments, it was inevitable that the authorities would be contacted. The moment this was reported, Descamps' name would become synonymous with these various body parts scattered around the city. The presumption was that he encountered someone between the market and the Franklin, friend or foe, and was lured away. His home out in Beaverton was checked to see if he was there, and while he wasn't, there were some surprises to be found. The house was described as small and unpainted and disheveled in parts. Even a picture of the home published in the Oregon Daily Journal made it almost look like an abandoned house out in the woods. Hardly the place one would expect a man of such affluence to live. Food was found in the kitchen, about a week old, indicating no one had been there for days. Many bottles of medicine were found, even though Descamps was rarely known to ever be sick. And he had another kind of medicine in storage. Medicine of the hard alcohol variety. As an old saloon man, it should have been no surprise that Descamps had a large wine cellar complete with all sorts of drink, stored in his secluded home to be enjoyed throughout the years of Prohibition. In fact, the feds suspected him of having such a stock and were close to staging a raid on his home. And then he disappeared. The possibility of his being this victim, whose body parts were popping up in newspaper wrappings, was not just one of convenience. His general build fit well with the body parts that had been found. As a well-built man who was obviously erroneously described as being 5'10" and only 175 pounds, he matched well with these body parts. It was even noticed that the leg parts found were bent in a way that showed the victim had been bow-legged, something that Descamps was also known to be. A detective, Christopherson, who knew Descamps personally, said that the remains discovered tallied exactly with his features. But while many people were falling in line, Detective Jack Goltz was not so convinced. He also knew Descamps personally and was quoted on February 15th to say, "His arms were heavily covered with black hair, and he had a heavy head of hair and dark heavy mustache. There was hardly any hair on the parts of the body we have found so far, and what there is light-colored. The body doesn't show any signs of being shaved, so I am quite certain that this is not Descamps." Goltz was so convinced that Descamps was still alive somewhere that he contacted a man named Hector Momal, who had been put in charge of Descamps' affairs and estate while he was missing, and told him to not dispose of any property of his. This was the strongest argument made against Descamps being the victim, that the remains found weren't hairy enough. Granted, the parts of his body that Goltz described as hairy were parts that had not been found, and some people can have pretty hairy arms and not so hairy legs. With no immediate discoveries made after the February 10th finds in Kenton, the focus remained heavily on Ernest Descamps, especially as there were no other possible victims being considered. But with time, for a time, there was an increased emphasis on arguing that he was still alive somewhere. Beyond the hair issue, Detective Goltz stated that through his investigation, he had learned so many unsavory things about Descamps that if he was him, he'd pay just about anything to cover it up or split town if he felt these things were about to become public. But even if Goltz was right that these remains were not Descamps, it did not necessarily mean he was alive and well. A few days after the remains started popping up, a woman, Mrs. Harry McLeod, said that she saw Descamps in the vicinity of Aloha, just west of Beaverton. She saw him around noon on February 5th, the day he disappeared. This suggested a sighting of him after he was last seen by the Yamhill Market. But furthermore, Mrs. McLeod said that Descamps was traveling in a car with 2 other men. Who these men were, she couldn't say. But was it possible that he had been picked up and left with some men? Or was taken captive and possibly killed by these men? Authorities didn't think so. They didn't put much stock in McLeod's account, even though she knew Descamps and spoke to him when she saw him. It was possible, though, that she was confusing her days. But she wasn't the only one to throw a wrench into the timeline of when Descamps vanished. A man named Sam Goldenberg said that he saw Descamps in downtown Portland on February 7th, around 9:30 a.m. While he knew Descamps, like everyone else apparently, Goldenberg didn't speak to him. Descamps was standing in front of a window of Mathis's clothing store at 5th and Morrison, checking his reflection in a store window while he tried on what looked like a new hat. While investigators didn't put much stock in this account either, they still checked Mathis's to see if Descamps had bought a hat there. And no one working there remembered seeing him. However, if it was Descamps, the hat may have not been brand new and he may have bought it elsewhere. While there had been doubt brewing about Descamps being the murder victim, these witnesses were still not being taken very seriously. And finally, a man named Jim Pearson reported seeing Descamps on February 5th, again the last day he was seen alive, at the Pacific Steamship office at 3rd and Stark. He was inquiring about getting a ticket to travel to China. This specific office did not handle such things and told this man to go to the Canadian Pacific Steamship Company office at the Multnomah Hotel, just a few blocks away. Clerks at both offices were spoken to about whether they'd seen Descamps there or not, and in both cases, no one recalled seeing the missing Frenchman. But this was another angle to the contemplation that Descamps may have still been alive, and that he'd just left town. He did know a lot of women, and not just in the Portland area. He knew women all over the country. Several women were checked and had no idea what happened to him. But this included women like Jean Grivois, who lived in Michigan, and was checked to see if Descamps had visited her. Another woman named Eugenie Jobert, who would sue Descamps over a breach of promise because he wouldn't marry her, also didn't know where he was. And even Mrs. Grivois would later claim to be his common-law wife when matters of dealing with his rather large estate came around. It was even briefly considered that Mrs. Jobert may have left with Descamps when one of her friends, Carmen Dreyfus, could not make contact with her. But when investigators looked into the matter, they found Jobert alive and well in Scappoose, north of Portland. For a while, it was even theorized that Descamps had a mental lapse, as they called it, and left town in a state of confusion. At one point, Lieutenant Goltz said it wouldn't surprise him if a confused Portland man suddenly showed up in a town out east. But that never happened. In the end, there was nothing uncovered to validate the argument that Ernest Descamps had left town, or that he was even still alive. And regardless whether he was the murder victim or not, it still didn't bring authorities any closer to figuring out who the killer was. In one instance, on February 12th, reports of a man walking through the Lone Fir Cemetery in southeast Portland carrying a package wrapped in newspaper came through to the police. Several motorcycle officers stormed the cemetery moments later, but this man was never found. A handful of days became a week, and then another, and the questions lingered. Would there be any more finds? Where was Ernest Descamps? February 1920 came to an end with no new revelations. The story was already beginning to fade away. Sisters Virginia and Beatrice Winchell were acting like children, running around and playing in the neighborhood by their home on Northeast 80th Avenue near Failing Street in Northeast Portland. They wandered into a yard just off 81st and Failing, where there was a hole known as a can dump, literally a hole where people discarded cans. As the girls ran by, something caught their eye. In this hole, there were two partially opened packages. Even catching a small glimpse inside sent the girls fleeing from the scene in fear.
The last set of remains were found right near this intersection I'm walking up to. This is 80th and Failing. And here where this yellow house is now is where the Winchell family lived, and two girls, it was Virginia and Beatrice Winchell, were out running around playing, and there was a canning hole, I think is what it was called, which was literally just this big hole that you would throw your cans in when you were done with them. And while Beatrice and Virginia were just running around, they stumbled out of the canning hole and noticed there were two wrapped packages in there, and it scared them, so they ran back home, which I don't know if this house dates back to 1920. It could, but if it was, this would have been their house. And they ran to their house, told their dad that they found something that was odd to them. And he went out and checked and found that it was some more remains, presumably from the same victim.
In the can dump were uncovered a right arm from one package and a left thigh from the other. Both had been wrapped in pages from a February 3rd Morning Oregonian. The date was March 6th, 1920, the day that turned everything around again. The theories, unsubstantiated to this point, that Ernest Descamps was still alive and had left town faded away. It was noted these remains did have thick hair, like Descamps was known to have. Hector Momal, again Descamps' friend and the man watching over his estate, said upon seeing these remains that they absolutely belonged to his friend. "I have seen that poor man many, many times," was the comment Momal made, validating his conclusions that these were the body parts of Ernest Descamps. They'd been hacked violently like all the rest. Even Lieutenant Goltz at this point changed his tune and became more convinced that the murder victim was Descamps. It was also likely that these remains had been left in that can dump for some time, just secluded enough that it took almost a month to be found. Being wrapped in a newspaper from the same time period as the previous remains suggested they were all wrapped up at the same time and spread around town on the same night. The parts found also made sense in relation to who Descamps was. The killer was playing with investigators and even the intrigued citizens of Portland by only stashing the body parts that could not provide an absolute identification of the victim. No head was found, no hands to allow for possible fingerprints. Descamps had a distinct tattoo on his left arm, and while this man's right arm would be found, his left arm never was. And while a head was found down in Selwood the same day that the first remains were found in Sullivan's Gulch back in February, there was another find in Selwood close to when these can dump remains were found. A day earlier, March 5th, a human hand and foot were found by children in a slough in Selwood. While playing, one of these kids kicked the items into a deep pool of water, and officers were unable to recover them. While Descamps' hands and feet had yet to be recovered, the kids also said that these remains were in an advanced stage of decomposition. They may have belonged to the same person whose head had been found in February, which I could not fully verify did belong to Walter York. Funeral services for York wouldn't happen till months later, and it still didn't make sense for his head alone to end up here. It's possible these body parts were all related to another unsolved murder. Over the rest of March, there would be a few more false leads in relation to this case. On March 17th, a man named Edward Gill was staying at a rooming house at Russell and Albina in North Portland. He made a discovery and called the police, yelling, "Good God! I found Descamps' head in a box under my bed." There was, in fact, a head under his bed, but it belonged to someone else. Turned out the previous resident was a man named George Boyd, a collector of Native American relics who'd briefly gone on a trip to San Francisco. While he was away, his room, which still had some of his items in it, had been rented to Gill. On March 25th, bones from hands, an arm, and a pelvis were found on the roof of the Barker Apartments at 21st and Irving in Northwest Portland. Once again, Descamps was briefly considered. However, it was determined these bones belonged to someone dead a lot longer than Descamps could have been. It was even considered that these bones belonged to two different people. Later, an anonymous woman would call authorities telling them these bones were discarded from a medical school. And even in May of 1920, a former Portland police officer named J.S. Smith, then living in Alaska, stumbled onto an article about a human leg that had been found up there. He forwarded it back to Portland, for some reason thinking it might have been connected to the Descamps case. Imagine if it had been. Despite these false leads that did help keep the case alive, there were no more remains to be found after those found in that northeast Portland can dump. Not just in 1920, but forever. The victim's head, left arm, hands, upper torso, and feet would never be found. This continued to make a definitive identification of Descamps difficult. And while the evidence mainly pointed to him being the victim, an important question to address that has only been passively considered to this point is why? Why would someone want to kill Ernest Descamps? While it's unknown exactly when Ernest Descamps came to Portland, I was able to track him back as far as 1893. His name appeared in an October 7th Oregonian article after he struck a boy with a wagon that he'd been operating. In his early years, he worked as a delivery man for saloons, ultimately working at one located at 2nd and Davis. It's not said specifically which saloon this was, but the Senate Saloon was located at this intersection, a place run by one of the North End's most infamous characters, Liverpool Liz. I'll be getting back to her. After saving up, in 1903, Descamps was able to buy into the saloon business, something that would culminate in a business he ran with another man named Cesar Marco. Their business was located at 40 3rd Street. Today, this is the northeast corner of 3rd and Cooch, where the Estate Hotel is today. But something that surely helped Descamps in his efforts early on was his involvement in real estate, which I was able to trace back as far as the year 1901. In this blip from a September 5th, 1901 Oregonian, we can see he sold off a lot to a man named John Kilgreen. And that was only the start. From the 1900s into the 1910s, newspapers were peppered with passages like this showing Descamps' activity buying and selling properties and probably making some good money in the process. Therefore, even by 1903, this had an impact on his ability to move up in the saloon business. He was also only known to have been married once, although there would be claims to the contrary when matters of his estate came up later on. He married a woman named Catherine Stortz in 1902, and she passed away in 1905, leaving Descamps a widower, but never lacking for female attention. When numerous body parts started showing up around Portland in February 1920, in close proximity to a middle-aged local Frenchman going missing, the info published about his past was fairly meek and often void of the more unsavory details. He worked in the liquor business in the North End and was described as a man of exceedingly interesting character. But when Prohibition hit Oregon in 1916, his liquor business went under and he left the North End, settling in the small northwest Oregon town of Clatskanie. Later moving to the Beaverton area, he was living the good life, a home all to his own, business connections, and financial stability, things that couldn't be said for many of those he left behind in the North End. But he didn't entirely leave them behind. If his liquor business went under, one might ask where his stability came from. Well, it turns out he wasn't just another saloon owner in an area fraught with them. In terms of Descamps' business success, it's important to realize that he'd run a saloon in a place where saloons thrived the best, the North End, but he also ran a business selling liquor that he also profited from. And this meant sometimes that other saloons, which were a dime a dozen in the North End, were buying booze from him, among the other customers he had. And he was hardly immune from the greatest norm associated with saloons in this area at that time: the brothel. If you had a saloon in the North End and lodgings upstairs, you could bet your bottom dollar there were girls working up there. And Descamps had his own operation of this nature going on, something else he profited from. He became a very wealthy and influential man, and he achieved this very quickly. And with his life in this time not as well documented as others, who knows what else he may have been involved in. Considering his saloon and liquor dealing background, it's a strong bet he was involved in illegal booze operations, at least at some point. As a saloon operator, it's also likely he was involved in some smaller crimes that amounted to taking advantage of his drunkest patrons. It was a common tactic among saloon proprietors at this time to send their drunkest patrons upstairs with the girls who would pick their pockets clean. The most headlines he made prior to 1920 came in 1911 when he would get mixed up in a short-lived grafting scandal. The term grafting, just for those who don't know, it's kind of an older term, is an all-encompassing term for the exchange of money, goods, or property by illegal means, such as bribery, embezzlement, and extortion. In this case, several North End saloon proprietors claimed a Patty Mayer, a county detective, and Frank Perkins, a newspaper reporter, were working together to intimidate them into paying money for their, quote, protection. Descamps was one of these proprietors who testified that Mayer threatened to shoot him if he testified on the matter. And yet he did. He didn't tell Ernest Descamps what to do. When he said he was in full support of cleaning up the area, he was asked by Frank Perkins' attorney to close down his saloon and to stop associating with immoral women. In the end, to some controversy, a grand jury was convened, but no action was taken on the matter. When it came to paying off the cops, which was just another day at the office during these days in Portland, it's worth noting how affluent Descamps was and how his place never seemed to receive the same kind of harassment that other establishments did in the North End. In terms of his business with Cesar Marco, the only serious infraction I found on them happened in November 1912 when they were charged $200 for violating a liquor license ordinance. And, as briefly mentioned earlier, it's also worth mentioning that Descamps was a known associate with a woman who was born Elizabeth Smith, but was better known in the North End as Liverpool Liz, a larger-than-life character with her reputation mostly kept alive by articles written in the 1930s by early historian Stuart Holbrook. While Holbrook's contributions to certain elements of Portland's history have proven invaluable, he was also prone to exaggerate to sell his stories. But in a time where women couldn't even work as bartenders in Portland, Liz ran her own place, known as the Senate Saloon. While historically located in more than one place, it's best remembered for being at the northwest corner of 2nd and Davis. Descamps and Marco's business was not only on the same block, but on the same stretch of Davis Street. They were right next to each other and working in the same business. It was inevitable that their paths would cross. Descamps even managed to help secure a job for a fellow Frenchman with Liz's saloon in 1907, something that just might come back into play in this story. While regarded as more of an honest, straight shooter than Descamps and many others, Liz ran a North End establishment like anyone else. she had girls working for her upstairs, but she was objectively one of the North End's most memorable characters, and Descamps was close enough with her that when she passed away in 1913, it was noted he was one of the witnesses to her will, which had been written out in 1909. In fact, both he and Cesar Marco were the witnesses for a will that did come into question when it was produced. If you want to learn more on Liverpool Liz, there's a really great Google doc, Liverpool Liz, the Senate Saloon and Evergreen Park, by Jan DeLue, that goes into what is known and even inferred about Liz. But honestly, all of this saloon drama was small potatoes to Ernest Descamps, who, as his wealth grew, so did his influence. He was not just a corrupted, successful businessman, but also a key figure in the French underworld of Portland, Oregon. He was even referred to as the king, or the ruler, of this underworld, and he used his influence and money to help his fellow local underground figures. On the surface, Descamps was described as a banker and bondsman for these people who were mostly low-end criminals, often falling on hard times or finding themselves in trouble with the law. Hardly deserving of a lot of sympathy, these people were still taken advantage of by this larger-than-life former delivery man. As a banker of sorts, he helped out those facing financial hardships. And as a bondsman, again of sorts, when these underground figures ran afoul of the law, Descamps was there to bail them out. In 1907, he got mixed up in a lawsuit taken out by two North End figures who had been charged with living with women of ill repute. It was noted his connection to this case was related to posting bail for these two men. But none of this was charity. It was fully expected that these debts would be repaid, and if not, who knew what awaited these men? And I say who knew for a reason, because I can't say for certain what the usual penalties were for not making things right financially with Mr. Descamps, with the exception of one man, in one instance. But I'm saving that for a later section. He was also known to function as a sort of arbitrator when disputes arose among some of his fellow men, something wherein the decisions he made alone may have created hostilities from those involved. So Descamps was a powerful underworld figure who held the fate of a lot of his countrymen in the palm of his hand, and he held that power over their heads. He may have had some friends, those who didn't owe him a debt, perhaps his co-partner, Cesar Marco, possibly even Liverpool Liz. But the man did, in fact, have more enemies than friends. This was brought out further in a 1922 article where a Portland-based Frenchman, name never given, discussed what he knew about Mr. Descamps. When asked if he had friends in the underworld, the man responded saying yes, but he had more enemies. Some of his dealings with his followers were often colored with deceit and trickery, and many of these came to hate him, while at the same time they were too weak and futile to get themselves out of his clutches. He really took advantage of these people. And while it wouldn't surprise me if Descamps was mixed up in the illegal booze business, at least a little bit, after Prohibition took effect, the fact of the matter was, as many others felt the pinch in the North End from Prohibition's sting, Descamps was able to take his money and walk away. But not entirely. His banker-bondsman status did not end just because he left the North End. And even if it had, he still left behind many bitter and possibly vengeful individuals. And one of these characters may have had more reason than anyone else to seek vengeance against Ernest Descamps. This was really the perfect crime. For months and months after body parts were found scattered around town, there were no suspects, not even persons of interest. No one knew the circumstances of how the victim was led to his death or where the death occurred. Whoever had pulled it off either split town successfully or perhaps was living in town, maybe thinking they were safe. And beyond all of this, whether it was intentional or unintentional, the killer had left investigators scratching their heads and left a city both captivated and in fear. Sure, these remains all appeared to belong to one person, but who knew if or when this killer might strike again? If the victim was Ernest Descamps, strangely enough, actions he chose to take a couple years before his death may have played a role in possibly unraveling this case and sending investigators on the trail of the first person of interest found in this case. His name was Louis Victor Brayer, known in the criminal world as the Rabbit, and he was a one-time shady Frenchman in the same underworld that Descamps was part of in Portland. The two men had known each other at least as far back as 1907, when Descamps secured him work at the Senate Saloon at 2nd and Davis, the same one run by Liverpool Liz. But while Descamps provided this man a helping hand in the beginning, years later he would have perhaps a stronger motive than anyone else for wanting to take Descamps out. After a few years in Portland, Brayer would leave for Canada in 1914, along with a woman named Ernest Descamps, a woman who would stay his companion for quite some time. After a short time, they returned to Portland, where, by all accounts, he remained civil with Ernest Descamps. This was until a financial disagreement erupted between the two in 1918. While the details of this fight are unknown, considering Brayer's past, it wouldn't be surprising if he had been in debt to Descamps and Descamps wanted to settle the matter. Either way, Descamps decided to take action, because he knew a secret about Louis Brayer, that both he and Ernest Descamps were in America illegally. Descamps quickly reported the two to immigration officials, leading to them abruptly leaving town before their capture. The two fled to Montana, where they would ultimately be caught and sent to New York, where they would then be deported to France in November of 1918. Because of this, the head of Portland's Immigration Bureau, R.P. Bonham, took an interest in Brayer. Ultimately, an investigation would follow wherein the movements of Brayer and Descamps, who also went by the last name of Desjardins, were tracked up into early 1922 when the report on the investigation was completed. Bonham was key in terms of gathering information on this matter, but he didn't go into the investigative work thinking murder would become a part of it. In this investigation, Descamps, ratting Brayer out to immigration officials, was noted along with another interesting detail. Brayer, and Descamps for that matter, were both in Portland in February 1920. It was always assumed that the murder victim in this case was killed for revenge, and Brayer certainly had a motive to seek revenge against Ernest Descamps. And that's how a possible suspect was first established. Louis Victor Brayer, a man who just happened to be a butcher by trade, meaning he knew his way with a knife. According to this report, after being deported back to France in 1918, Brayer and Descamps decided to get married in order to make getting a passport easier so they could return to North America. They managed to make it to Mexico in early 1919, where Descamps said they stayed most of the year, but Brayer would say they made it into the US, also in early 1919. They would eventually make it to Portland, where it was theorized Brayer killed Descamps out of revenge before fleeing north to Vancouver, British Columbia, where he and Descamps stayed until September 1921. They then re-enter the United States, venturing to Galveston, Texas. Once there, Bonham tracked down their whereabouts and contacted local authorities to have them arrested and held for questioning. However, a local Galveston cop tipped them off that they were wanted in exchange for $10. While Detour would be captured, Breyer managed to escape and return to France. Detour would be questioned on the Descamps matter, but there was never enough to keep her. She would then be deported back to France as well, where she would reconnect with her husband. Despite being thousands of miles away, Bonham contacted Paris authorities on the Descamps matter, and these authorities did question both Breyer and Detour on the matter. On the question of when they heard about Descamps' murder, Detour said she first heard about it when they fled to Montana in 1918. Apparently, she was a clairvoyant and knew about it 2 years in advance. Breyer said he first heard about it while in Paris in October 1921. However, he was known to still be in North America at this time. The two would return to North America via New Brunswick in Canada in January 1922. It's unknown why they kept returning to North America, knowing at any moment they might get caught and have to answer some questions about that little 1920 murder back in Portland. Bonham was notified of their return and that they were headed for Montreal, and he asked that they be held there so that they could finally be questioned. Once again, Breyer was tipped off as to what was coming, and both he and Detour quickly caught a steamer back to France. But, of course, they came back again. A couple months later, in late June 1922, they were arrested in Vancouver, British Columbia. When they were apprehended, the authorities notified Bonham back in Portland, and an officer H. Christopherson, who'd been involved in the Descamps investigation from the beginning, was sent north to question them. But when he arrived, they somehow were gone. Again. Without notifying Portland authorities, the police in British Columbia released Breyer. He and Detour split town so fast that they left their luggage behind. The mere idea that these people would be released baffled those in Portland, but regardless, the rabbit had slipped away again, and Portland authorities would never have another shot at him. While nothing more was gained from Breyer after he became a person of interest, he still had a possible motive for going after Ernest Descamps. But did he really do it? Would he really spend more than a year filled with vengeance? Planning out a way to sneak back into America? Would he really kill and dismember another man for reporting him to immigration? If he was brutally violent and unstable, maybe. But this question gets back to the heart of the French underworld, not just in Portland, but in France. This is the one aspect of Descamps' past in the French underworld that I held back so as to use it in relation to Louis Victor Breyer. Certainly Descamps had made his enemies in Portland, plenty of men who would have taken great pleasure in a bout of vengeance against him. But he was a man at the top, and thus taking him out came with risks. But the Breyer case was a different thing altogether. Long after the Descamps murder mystery had faded from memory, an article was published in the Oregonian on March 17, 1929. Its title, "Why Was Ernest Descamps Fed to the Dogs?" It clearly came from the perspective that he was the murder victim, but it sought to take a closer look at why it might have happened. And while Breyer, the rabbit, was mentioned, it was only passive near the end of the article. But this piece went beyond just what had happened in Portland to take a glance at the French underworld in general. In this culture, there was an oath known to all which simply said, "I will feed my enemy to the dogs." Specifically, This meant that when one took to the ultimate act of revenge in killing their adversary, this was followed by cutting their body up and scattering it around to provide food for the dogs, so to speak. Descamps was part of this world, and it appeared he had died exactly this way. The story of how he passed and how his remains were discovered represented a shocking story for the city of Roses, but this was a far more common thing in France, with reports of body parts scattered in the suburbs of Paris being a fairly regular occurrence. And in terms of why nobody, to this point, had been apprehended, it may have been as simple as the stealthy methods those in the French underworld employed. The article stated, "Their methods are too decisive and they stick together too well afterward. The fear of death keeps the lips of all tightly sealed." And that's highly important here. Like most elements of organized crime, they had an oath to secrecy. If you were a rat, others acted accordingly. And in reporting Louis Brayer to immigration, Descamps had broken that rule by ratting out a fellow member of the underground. In the article from 1922 I mentioned earlier, wherein an anonymous Frenchman from Portland was spoken to, he said, as far as he knew, Brayer was the only person Descamps ratted out in such a way. And in terms of being a rat, this man said, "You know the characters of the underworld detest anyone who informs. It is an unwritten but inevitable code that those who tell must be got rid of." Descamps may have been near the top and Brayer near the bottom or somewhere between, but it still made Descamps even more detestable to his fellow countrymen than he already had been. He had been an informer, and he would inevitably be dealt with. In this case, Brayer would not only potentially feel like he had a valid reason to seek out vengeance, but he would have also been on the right side of this unwritten code. He may have also been a criminal, but at least he wasn't a rat. As the next couple years after this 1929 article passed, there would be no further revelations on the matter. Everyone still agreed Descamps was probably the victim. But little did people realize, less than 2 years after this article was published, an answer had been found. While it wouldn't come out until late April 1935, a writer named Jack DeWitt had traveled to the French penal colony on Devil's Island in French Guiana, South America. Established back in the 1850s, it developed a reputation as one of the most insufferable prisons in the world. Stories written about those who had experienced the world of Devil's Island were fairly common, especially with those who had made escapes from there. And thus it made sense that a crime writer, as DeWitt was at the time, would visit such a place. He was planning on covering a particular subject while there, but after his arrival, one of the authorities there told him of a man who was soon to be executed, and who had made a most interesting confession. It was December 19th, 1930, when Jack DeWitt sat down with a prisoner there named Edouard Henry Lepon. Lepon had been sent to Devil's Island for a murder he committed back in France, but after killing another inmate there at Devil's Island, he was sentenced to death. The following day, December 20th, he would go to the guillotine and be shuffled off this mortal coil. In making a confession to DeWitt, Lepon also wrote out a very brief confession that read, "I had a friend in an American city, and I cut up the body of this man, and which parts and portions of I placed in newspaper and buried in various parts of the property. Justification of this crime reverts to a woman whose actions I will never be able to explain." And that was it. Quick and to the point. No elaboration. but he had admitted to killing a man in an American city and, crucial detail, wrapping his body parts up in newspaper and placing them at various different locations. It matched what happened back in 1920, as well as a blueprint. And to further verify that this confession was absolutely in reference to Ernest Descamps and that brutal Portland murder back in 1920, is who this man actually was. His name was only an alias, with his last name, Lapin, meaning rabbit in French. The Rabbit. The real name of the man who made this confession was Louis Victor Breyer, the only person of interest who ever came up in the Descamps matter. With nothing left to hide and no reason to fear further legal ramifications, he finally confessed to this crime. It's hard to say in his confession how he felt about the whole thing all these years later. He did what he set out to do, and he may have even been proud in finally being able to tell the world, but even so, he started the confession with, "I had a friend." He would meet his end, perhaps with as clean a conscience as someone like him could achieve, and when Portland authorities learned of this confession, it was all they needed to finally wrap up this long-standing murder mystery. The one peculiarity, however, in all of this is that while it was 100% presumed before this that Descamps had been murdered for ratting Breyer out to immigration, here Breyer states it was over a woman whose actions he could not explain. At the time, it was inferred the woman in question was Ernest Descamps, who still went on to marry and be with Breyer. With what we know, this part of the confession seems to suggest a possible love triangle, that perhaps a woman, maybe Miss Detour, or whomever, that both men were interested in had, at least for a moment, chosen Ernest Descamps. Perhaps Descamps and Detour had an affair. One thing we know about this man is that he liked his women. So much so that he literally had a working list of women's phone numbers and addresses at his home and the hotel he stayed at. It's impossible to say for sure, but it completely changes what we know about this story. If the woman in question was Miss Detour, then perhaps an affair did occur while Descamps and Breyer were arguing over money matters, and Descamps really wanted to hit him where it hurts. And then, the ultimate insult, afterward he reported both of them to immigration. He cheated with her and then had her kicked out of the country. In this theory, the being ratted out still plays a role, if not being the only factor. Perhaps Breyer had intended on taking his vengeance out on Descamps for this infidelity, but in being reported and having to flee the city as quickly as he did not yet have the opportunity to plan it out and take action. This is all speculation, obviously, just a method to try and understand Breyer's claims that this was over a woman and her unexplainable actions. It's one of a few elements of this story that we will never know the full truth about. With the confession from Edouard Henry Lapin, for some reason not made public for nearly 4.5 years, the consensus was that this grisly 1920 Portland murder was finally solved, and it had been Ernest Descamps the whole time. Perhaps the ongoing belief of many that he was the victim all along, combined with it losing that alluring status as an unsolved mystery, are why this story is so forgotten. Nowhere, even amidst history writers who have focused in on the darker elements of Portland's history, have any of them talked about the butcher killing of Ernest Descamps. It's really been lost to history, and I probably never would have found it had I not dedicated a good part of the year 2019 to looking up info on old Portland murders. Even when I stumbled onto old articles about this crime, I put it aside, knowing it stood out against the others. I put together a video on this case back in 2020, but that video never felt like it was my first and last words on the matter. I found more information, elaborated on a few more things, and also wanted to take a moment near the end here to ponder over what might have happened. With the lacking in detail confession Lapon, Brayer, provided, we still don't know exactly how everything went down. And we never will.
So you haven't seen a lot of me like this, talking to you in this video, but I wanted to reflect a little bit. This is obviously just speculation based on what we know, because even though we have a confession that I feel like all things considered, this case is closed. I know people can make an argument, well, he didn't say Descamps' name, he didn't say it was in Portland, but I mean, let's be honest here. Now, because the confession was very lacking in detail, there's a lot we don't know. We know, obviously, this guy, Brayer, got to Descamps and was able to kill him in a way that was, time consuming compared to just walking up to somebody and killing them on the street and running away. So we don't know exactly how it went down. He never went into those details. And as far as what we know, I have a working theory that I feel best probably, I feel like it's the best theory you can come up with in terms of probably what happened. And I came to this mainly because, well, there was a lot of questions I had in terms of, like, this guy sneaks back into Portland, then he just kills this guy, butchers him, pulls off this amazing crime, and does it in a way where, for a long time, locals around here didn't know. They didn't even just not know who did it. They didn't necessarily, for certainty, know who the victim was. You don't just roll into town with vengeance on your mind and pull that off unless you're lucky, and I don't think that was the case here. So what I personally think is that before Brayer even got to Portland, or maybe when he first got here, we don't know exactly how long he was in town during February 1920. Hell yeah, brother. But I feel like whether he did it ahead of time or he did it once he got here, I think Brayer made some connections with old colleagues, old acquaintances in the French underworld in Portland that he would know that might be willing to help him, and who maybe themselves had a run-in with Ernest Descamps. Again, he made a lot of enemies in his time in the French underworld. There was probably a lot of people that would have liked him to see the ending that he ultimately did. So what I'm saying is Brayer had help. And I was thinking, how does he track Descamps? How does he, get close enough to where he's able to catch him between the market and his hotel? How does he get him, how does he lure him away? How does he do all this stuff without being seen? I don't think he just leaped up and attacked the guy, because he most likely would have been seen in that regard. But also, where did he take his body to do what he did? He would have needed some time to, do what he did. And I don't think he checked out a hotel room, stuffed Descamps' body in a bag, dragged him through the lobby, getting a lot of attention, then dragged him up into his room and made a bloody mess. Yeah, easily discovered. There's body parts turning up around Portland. There was this random guy here last week who dragged something into our hotel, and then there was just a filthy, bloody mess all over his room when he left. I think definitely having some help answers a lot of those questions, and in particular, how do you transport Descamps wherever he was taken to? He probably made connections with someone who had a vehicle available to them. It's a lot easier to transport a man
in a vehicle than trying to throw him onto a carriage or trying to drag him off somewhere. It would be a lot easier to pull off with a lot less drama, and you stand the chance of not being seen by having some help, having others there ready to help grab Descamps whenever that happens, whether he was lured somewhere. I feel like Breyer maybe, you know, he got some details about what he did. I mean, it was well known around town. It seems like everybody knew Ernest Descamps, but it was well known that he came into town usually 2 times a week, and even what days he was usually in town. So these people that were still in town, they probably helped Breyer in that regard too. So they're able to kind of figure out where he is, track him, lure him away. Maybe Breyer bumps into him, does the, and, you know, instead of being like, it's you, you're a dead man, he, you know, does something else to the effect of, hey, you know, I know we've had a rough past together, but how about we bury the hatchet? Let's go get a drink somewhere. And then he lures Descamps to a less populated area, maybe leads him through a, you know, more secluded stretch of road, presumably leading him to a saloon or whatever. However it happened, he's grabbed, he's overpowered, he's incapacitated, he's placed in a vehicle, and then he's taken somewhere. And that, I feel, is another situation where it's likely Breyer had help, probably from some fellow French underworld figures who probably themselves did not care for Ernest Descamps. This is probably a, you know, disturbing though it was, this is probably a very cathartic experience for them. And I feel like even having those connections would secure Breyer a place to put Descamps' body where outsiders could be kept away, and, you know, a place where some of his fellow local Frenchmen would have control over, so they can put Descamps' body in this place. No one's gonna know, no one's gonna see, and he has this place available to him as long as he needs to do what he does. And he's in probably in a building that had some sand particles, some sawdust kind of things that were found on these remains. He obviously had himself a collection of newspapers to wrap these body parts in, and I think that's how it went down. And it would even make sense in terms of depositing these remains around town. I mean, the 3 collections of remains that were found were all found at locations a fairly good distance apart. You know, I don't think Breyer was just wandering the streets doing that. He probably, again, had a car made available to him by someone, or someone was driving him around. And that was part of their system, was, you know, people in the French underground. If you did someone wrong, sometimes the punishment you received was you got chopped up and fed to the dogs. And I think that's probably how it went down. And if that is how it went down, my thought is, I feel like most likely wherever Descamps was gathered was grabbed from, probably, you know, somewhere between the Yamhill market and his hotel, since he was presumably heading back to his hotel after going to the market, and he was gonna, you know, eventually head to a meeting he had and then eventually head home. I feel like if these are the players that were involved, he was probably taken to some building on the north end. And that is where Breyer took care of things. And that could even make sense if you think he did it there, because after you wrap up these remains, you can shoot right across the steel bridge, or even the Burnside Bridge, either one. And right after you cross the river, you're literally right next to Sullivan's Gulch. And so you can pull over to the side of the road, look around, yeet, get in the car, zoom north, you know, on Union Avenue, Vero, or like whatever way they went. They eventually made it to Kenton, which is where I'm recording this from right now, just for the record. Find a kind of nice dark place, pull over, pull the packages out, stick them into a little thicket, you know, hide them, but make them just visible enough that someone's probably gonna find them. And then they zoom across town to 81st and Failing, and again, they leave them in this can dump, you know, hidden, but just exposed enough that someone would probably see them and eventually pull them out.
They could have gone down any number of streets to make that happen. They could have gone down, they probably would have just backtracked slightly to Lombard and then just gone down Lombard a long ways, because you get pretty close to the vicinity of where those last remains were found near 81st and Failing. And then those remains are left there. Maybe they put some remains elsewhere that were never found. But again, most of the remains that were never found, it was established they could possibly be used to determine for absolute certainty that Ernest Descamps was the victim, such as his head. He had a tattoo on one of his arms. His hands were never found. Obviously, if they had been, they could have tried doing fingerprints and possibly finding it out that way. So who knows if they deposited more packages elsewhere that were never found. If they did, there probably wasn't a whole lot in there. And it is interesting in this Selwood case that I feel like these instances of body parts being found out in Selwood, I don't feel like they, to the best of their ability, really solved those situations. One, they really couldn't determine because they couldn't even get to the remains. And the other one, they kind of inferred it was a certain someone but couldn't explain how his head got from here to here. And I just find it interesting. And the way they described the head of that was found was that he had dark hair and a dark mustache, which matches Ernest Descamps to a T. I'm not saying he was the head in Selwood was his. I'm just saying, interesting. And then there was some other body parts that were found in Selwood that I believe matched with parts that hadn't been found of this one victim. And these kids accidentally knocked him into, I guess, a deeper place in the water. And the authorities couldn't get to him. So it was, they could never figure out, exactly what those were, who they belonged to. The kids said they were in advanced state of decomposition, but, were these little kids experienced in seeing dead body parts? I don't know. So, I don't know, maybe at least one of those is related to Descamps, and it could kind of make sense. It's way off on another end of town. Really can't say, but that's my working theory as to how this whole thing went down.
Above all else, I don't see Brayer doing this all without help. If he did, it must have been an impressive plan. And while his confession, many years later, did leave some questions and doesn't reference Ernest Descamps by name, I still think we can close the chapter on this story knowing who the victim and at least who the primary perpetrator were. Thank you.